It was a calm Tuesday evening when Tom stepped into the downtown diner, a place he'd frequented for years. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, announcing his presence to the familiar faces inside. The restaurant was a quaint, rustic establishment, with mismatched tables and worn leather booths. A warm glow emanated from the overhead lights, casting soft shadows across the room. The clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation created a comforting background hum, the kind of atmosphere Tom had always enjoyed. It felt like home, a place where he could come to unwind, enjoy a hearty meal, and relax after a long day. He glanced around, noticing a few familiar faces seated at various tables, but no one seemed to pay him much attention. He made his way to his usual booth in the back corner of the restaurant, far enough from the door to avoid any interruptions, but close enough to watch the comings and goings of the staff. He slid into the booth with ease, the vinyl seats creaking slightly as he settled in. Tom wasn't one to make waves. He was a quiet man, content with his routine, and he liked the simplicity of life. Tonight, he was wearing his signature Red Make America Great Again hat, a symbol of his political views that had become something of a trademark for him. He'd worn it to countless rallies, debates, and even just around town. For Tom, it was a statement, a belief in the values that had shaped his life. But more than that, it was a part of his identity, something he was proud of. The diner, though friendly and welcoming, wasn't exactly a place where political discussions flourished. It was a local, family-owned spot, known for its hearty burgers, hot coffee, and good service. Most people came for the food and the casual atmosphere, not to engage in heated political debates. That suited Tom just fine. He wasn't here to argue with anyone. He was here to enjoy a meal in peace. As he sat back in the booth, the waitress, Sarah, a young woman in her 20s, came over to take his order. She was polite and friendly, her uniform crisp and neat. Sarah had served Tom countless times before, always with a smile, and she seemed to recognize him immediately as he sat down. Tom liked her. She had a way of making people feel comfortable, no matter how busy the restaurant got. "Hey, Tom," Sarah said, her voice light and cheerful. "The usual?" Tom nodded, smiling back at her. "Yep, just the usual, cheeseburger, fries, and a cold beer." Sarah jotted it down on her notepad and glanced up, her eyes landing on his hat. For a moment her smile faltered just slightly, but it was enough for Tom to notice. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. He was used to the occasional raised eyebrow when he wore the hat in public. It wasn't the first time someone had reacted like that. "You sure about that hat?" she asked, a little hesitantly. Tom blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" "Well," Sarah said, glancing around the restaurant and then back at him, it's a little, controversial. Some of the other customers might not be too happy with it." She shifted uneasily, her voice softening as she added, "We don't want any trouble, especially tonight. It's been a bit busy." Tom sighed, realizing where the conversation was going. He had heard this sort of thing before. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to tell him how to behave based on what he was wearing. He didn't mind, of course, but it was getting old. He had every right to wear the hat if he wanted to, and he wasn't about to let anyone dictate that. "Oh, it's just a hat," he said calmly, looking her in the eye. "I'm here to eat, just like everyone else. No politics, just a quiet dinner." "Yeah, I get that. I'm not sure how the others will feel about it." Before Tom could respond, the manager, Greg, appeared from behind the counter. He was a tall man with a stocky build, known for his no-nonsense attitude. Tom had seen him around the diner many times, but he wasn't one to strike up a conversation unless he had to. Greg approached the table with purpose, his eyes scanning Tom's hat with a hint of disapproval. "Everything okay, Sarah?" "Everything okay, Sarah?" Greg asked, his voice low but firm. Yeah, just wanted to make sure we didn't stir anything up," Sarah replied, her tone hesitant. "With the hat." Greg looked at Tom, his expression unreadable, After a long pause, he finally spoke. "We've had some complaints in the past about certain things, you know? We don't want to upset anyone." Tom's patience was starting to wear thin. "I'm not here to upset anyone, Greg. I'm just here to have a meal. The hat doesn't mean anything to me in this context. It's just a hat. I understand that, but—" Greg trailed off, glancing around the room, noticing a few curious stares. "We can't risk making anyone uncomfortable. We have regulars who come in here, and I'm sure you understand how things can get when there's tension." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're asking me to leave because of a hat?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Greg hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. "It's not just the hat, it's the potential for trouble. We've had incidents before, and we don't want that here." Tom's mind raced, but he tried to keep his cool. This wasn't how he wanted the night to go, but it was clear that the staff wasn't willing to back down. A sense of frustration crept into his chest, but he didn't want to escalate the situation. He had seen enough of this type of thing in his life, people making assumptions, jumping to conclusions based on outward appearances. "I see," he said slowly, standing up from the booth. "So, you're telling me that I can't eat here just because of what's on my head?" Greg's expression hardened, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he nodded toward the door, his body language clear. "I'm sorry, Tom, but that's the policy. We don't want to cause any trouble." Tom stared at him for a moment, his jaw tightening. He had never expected to be treated like this in a place he considered his own. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but he couldn't help feeling a sense of betrayal. He had been coming to this diner for years, enjoying the simple pleasure of a good meal and good company, and now he was being shown the door over something as trivial as a hat. "All right then," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I leave." As Tom turned toward the door, he felt the eyes of the room on him, the stares heavy and judgmental. He was used to being looked at in public, but this was different. It wasn't curiosity or casual interest. It was disdain. And for what? Because of a piece of cloth on his head? With a final glance back at the booth where he had been sitting just moments ago, Tom exited the diner, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Tom stepped out into the chilly evening air, the door to the diner clicking shut behind him with a soft metallic thud. The streets outside were quiet, the sounds of the city muffled by the layers of nightfall that were beginning to settle. His breath came out in soft puffs as he stood there, a moment of stillness hanging in the air. His hands were clenched into fists, the frustration bubbling inside him, but he refused to let it show. He took a deep breath and looked up at the dimly lit street ahead. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He had come to the diner to escape the stresses of the day, to enjoy his burger and fries in peace. And now, here he was, standing on the sidewalk, alone. The unfairness of it stung him deeper than he cared to admit. He didn't need to be a politician or a pundit to understand how divisive the hat was, but to have it used as a reason to kick him out of a place he considered a sanctuary, well, that just didn't sit right. Tom wasn't the type to make waves. He didn't go looking for trouble, but this was different. It wasn't about the hat itself anymore. It was about principle. He was being treated like an outsider in a place he had supported, a place he had helped keep in business for years. And for what? Because of a piece of cloth that represented a political stance? That was the world they were living in now. Everyone seemed ready to judge based on appearances, based on their own biases. For a moment, Tom considered just walking away. Let it go, he told himself. He had bigger things to worry about than a petty argument over a hat. But then, a voice in the back of his mind spoke louder than any rational thought. This isn't right. His eyes narrowed as he turned away from the diner and began walking down the sidewalk, the cold air biting at his skin. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty street. He didn't know exactly what he was planning to do, but he was determined not to let this slide. Not this time. He was already thinking about the next steps, his mind racing. He could just leave it alone, he supposed. He could go home, take the hat off, and forget the whole thing. But something told him he wouldn't be able to. Not without some kind of closure. There were too many questions swirling in his head. Why had they treated him this way? Was it really about the hat, or was there something more? Maybe it was just a simple misunderstanding, an overreaction, but he wasn't sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. As he walked, the glow of the diner's lights began to fade behind him, replaced by the soft hum of street traffic in the distance. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a text from his best friend, Alex. "Hey, you good? Wasn't expecting you to leave so soon." Tom stood still for a moment, staring at the screen. He hadn't told anyone about the incident. He hadn't even fully processed it himself. But now, seeing the message, a sudden rush of emotion flooded him. The feeling of being pushed out, of being made to feel unwelcome. Settled deeper within him. Not really. Had a little problem at the diner. Alex's response came quickly. "What happened? You okay?" Tom stood there, his thumb hovering over the keyboard as he thought about what to say. It wasn't like him to open up about stuff like this, but there was something about the situation that felt bigger than just a minor disagreement. He typed a few words, paused, then typed more. "They kicked me out because of the hat." A few seconds passed before Alex responded. "Wait, what? Are you serious? They kicked you out for wearing a hat?" Tom felt his frustration building again as he read the text. He wasn't surprised by the reaction, but somehow it made it feel all the more ridiculous. "Yeah," said it might stir up trouble. "They've had complaints before." "What kind of complaints? That's crazy." Tom didn't have the energy to type a long response. He was getting tired of explaining it. "I don't know. Just didn't feel right." Alex's response came with a flurry of exclamation marks. "That's ridiculous, man. You should said something." "Did you talk to the manager?" Tom shook his head, the anger still simmering inside him. It wasn't like he hadn't tried to talk to Greg, but Greg had made his decision, and Tom wasn't in the mood to argue with someone who already had his mind made up. "I did. He didn't care. Just asked me to leave." A long pause followed as Tom continued walking, trying to calm himself down. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. Had to get some space. "Well, man, I don't know what to say. But if I were you, I'd go back there and talk to them. Let them know who you are. They'll probably back off once they realize who they've just kicked out." The suggestion caught Tom off guard. He hadn't thought about that. Of course, he knew who he was. But it wasn't about that. It wasn't about flexing his status. It was about being treated like a normal customer, not some kind of pariah just because of what was on his head. Still, Alex had a point. Tom had been coming to that diner for years. It was his place, and he wasn't about to let it be taken away from him over a misunderstanding. Maybe it was time for a little truth to be revealed. Maybe it was time to remind them who he was, and why he had a right to be there. He glanced down at his hat once again, the red fabric that had become so iconic. It felt different now, though. It wasn't just a political statement. It was a symbol of something bigger. It was a badge of resilience, of standing up for himself in a world that seemed to want to silence voices like his. He didn't need to apologize for it, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel like he should. Tom made up his mind. He was going back. The decision to go back wasn't an easy one, but Tom couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he needed to. He had to take control of this situation, if not for himself, then for the principle of fairness. So, with his phone still buzzing with text messages from Alex, he turned around and headed back toward the diner. The cold night air felt sharper now, like the chill of a world that had turned indifferent to his frustrations. The lights from the diner grew brighter as he approached, the warmth from inside casting long shadows on the sidewalk. He could see the neon open sign flickering in the window, and the sound of muffled chatter escaped into the quiet night as the door swung open for customers leaving. Tom's steps quickened, his resolve hardening with every footfall. As he reached the door, his hand hovered over the handle for a moment. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get, but he knew it would be a confrontation. Still, he wasn't afraid of that. He'd been through worse, much worse, and this didn't scare him. He pushed the door open with a firm shove, the bell above the door jingling as he entered. The warm air from inside wrapped around him, and the faint smell of fried food mixed with the sharper scent of coffee and grease. It was the same diner he had been coming to for years, but it felt different now, somehow. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if everyone inside could sense something was about to happen. Greg, the manager, was standing near the counter, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He didn't immediately notice Tom enter, too focused on the tasks at hand. But it didn't take long for the other employees to spot him. A few eyes flicked toward him, and Tom saw the expressions shift: surprise, discomfort, and maybe even a bit of unease. They must have heard about the incident already. He stood still for a moment, gathering himself. This was going to be awkward, but it had to be done. It was Greg who saw him first. His eyes widened slightly before he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Hey, Tom," Greg called, his tone a little too casual, like he was trying to play it off. "Did you forget something?" Tom didn't respond right away. He walked up to the counter, his eyes locking onto Greg's. The manager's smile faltered as Tom came closer, the tension building in the air. Tom could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a statement. "No, I didn't forget anything," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "I just thought we needed to have a little chat." Greg's expression shifted, his forced smile turning into a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. Oh, sure. What's on your mind?" The other employees were now watching, some pretending to be busy, others trying not to make it too obvious they were eavesdropping. The whole diner felt like it was holding its breath. Tom glanced around the room, taking in the familiar faces of regular customers seated at their booths. They didn't know what was going on, of course, but he could feel the undercurrent of discomfort in the room. The atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just a normal dinner rush anymore. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Tom said, his voice steady. "About the hat." Greg looked confused for a moment, but then his eyes darted down to the red cap still perched on Tom's head. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Tom could see the change in Greg's eyes. He recognized the hat now, but it didn't change his demeanor. "Look, Tom," Greg started, his voice a little too defensive. "It's just that, well, you know how it is. Some people don't like seeing that kind of thing around here. We've had complaints." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Complaints?" he asked, his voice laced with incredulity. "You had complaints about a hat? That's why you kicked me out?" Greg shifted uncomfortably, clearly on edge. "It's not just the hat," he mumbled, glancing around the room nervously. "It's everything that comes with it. You know how some people can get, right?" Tom's jaw tightened. He had heard the insinuations before. The assumptions that came with wearing a MAGA hat. People saw it as a statement of support for a particular political ideology, a stance that automatically made someone a target for ridicule or even outright hostility. But Tom didn't wear the hat because of any political statement. It wasn't about supporting a president or a party. It was about a message that resonated with him personally. It was about making a stand for what he believed in, whether people agreed with him or not. He took a step closer to Greg, locking eyes with the manager. "And what exactly do you think it says about me?" he asked, his voice low but carrying a weight of authority that caught Greg off guard. Greg faltered, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not about you personally, Tom," he stammered. "It's just that some people take offense. We've had a few customers leave because of it. They said it made them feel uncomfortable." Tom shook his head, his mind racing. He had been coming to this diner for years. He had been loyal, a steady presence who had supported Greg's business. And this was how he was treated. "I don't care what other people think," Tom said firmly. "I'm not here to cater to everyone's feelings. I'm here as a paying customer, and I'm here to eat. If that's a problem, then maybe it's not my issue." Greg looked down, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Tom, look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." But Tom cut him off, his voice growing sharper. "No, Greg, you didn't mean to, but that's exactly what happened. You made a decision without knowing who I was or why I wear this hat. You just assumed I was some political statement." Tom's words hung in the air as the room grew even quieter. The other customers, the staff, Everyone seemed to be waiting for Greg's next move. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he wasn't backing down now. Tom's words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was complete silence in the diner. Even the usual background hum of sizzling food and clinking silverware seemed to fade. It was as if the whole room was holding its breath, unsure of what would happen next. Greg stood there, his face flushed, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. He had been a manager at the diner for years, but now, faced with the consequences of his own actions, he was floundering. Tom could see it. Greg was caught in a moral bind, trying to balance the pressures of his job, the expectations of his staff, and the discomfort of the customers. It wasn't an easy position to be in, but Tom wasn't about to let him off the hook. "You're right about one thing, Greg," Tom continued, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "You didn't know who I was, but now you do." Greg's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face as he took a small step back, his nervous energy palpable. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice shaky. "What are you saying, Tom?" Tom felt a twinge of satisfaction. Now, it was his turn to surprise Greg. "I'm the owner of this place," he said, his tone unwavering. "I'm the one who signs the checks, who keeps this place running, and the one you just kicked out for wearing a hat." The words landed with the force of a bombshell. For a brief moment, Greg was speechless, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't find the right words. His gaze flicked from Tom to the other employees and back again, but no one dared speak. Tom could see the color draining from Greg's face. You're the owner," Greg finally stammered, the realization settling in like a cold weight. Tom nodded, a sense of quiet pride swelling inside him. It wasn't something he had ever flaunted. He didn't go around telling people that he was the one who funded the diner, or that he had built it from the ground up. To him, it wasn't about status. It was about ownership, responsibility, and the hard work he had put in to make this place what it was. "Yes," Tom said firmly, his eyes never leaving Greg's. "I am, and I'm here because I want to know why you thought it was okay to kick me out of my own business. Because of a hat." Greg's eyes darted nervously to the other employees, who were watching the scene unfold. Tom could see the discomfort written across their faces, the unease of realizing that their boss, the man who had given them their jobs, was standing right in front of them, confronting the very person they had been serving for years. The tension in the room was palpable, but Tom wasn't backing down. "I didn't think," Greg began, but Tom cut him off. "No, you didn't think," Tom said sharply. "You acted on an assumption, and now it's blowing up in your face." Greg swallowed hard, his expression a mixture of disbelief and guilt. "Tom, I didn't mean to offend you. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it was for the best." "Doing the right thing?" Tom echoed, incredulous. "By kicking me out? For wearing a hat?" Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Tom continued. "You have no idea what this hat means to me, or what it represents, and frankly, that's not your job to judge. You work here, you serve food, and you treat your customers with respect. That's it." Greg's shoulders slumped as if the weight of Tom's words had finally hit him. He glanced over at the other employees again, but they were all looking down, not wanting to make eye contact. It was clear that Greg was struggling to process the situation. He hadn't just wronged a random customer. He had offended the owner, someone who had given him his livelihood. The reality of that hit him hard, and it showed. "I'm sorry, Tom. I really am," Greg muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have handled it differently. I shouldn't have made assumptions about you." Tom nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. He didn't want to see Greg lose his job over this, but there had to be consequences. Greg needed to understand the weight of his actions. "Look," Tom said, taking a deep breath. "I'm not here to ruin your life. I don't want you to lose your job over this. But you need to think about what you're doing, and how you treat people who come in here. The next time someone walks through that door wearing something you don't agree with, don't assume you know who they are or what they stand for. Just serve them." Greg nodded quickly, looking genuinely remorseful. "I understand, Tom. I won't make that mistake again. I promise, Tom exhaled, feeling a bit of the tension leave his shoulders. He wasn't interested in punishing Greg. He just wanted to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen again. That was more important than anything else. But as the silence stretched on, Tom knew that the impact of this conversation would resonate beyond just Greg. The employees in the diner were all witnessing this exchange, and they were learning an important lesson in respect, responsibility, and humility. Tom turned to face the rest of the room. The diners were still watching, some pretending to focus on their meals, others blatantly staring. He didn't care. He wasn't here for their approval. You all have a choice, Tom said, his voice steady and strong, addressing the room as a whole. You can choose to judge people based on what they wear, or you can choose to serve them with respect, regardless of their views or what they stand for. The choice is yours. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then, as if on cue, a few of the diners began nodding, understanding the point Tom was making. He wasn't asking anyone to agree with him, but he was asking for fairness, for decency, for the recognition that everyone, regardless of their politics or personal beliefs, deserved the same treatment. Tom turned back to Greg, who was still standing there, looking like he had just been given a second chance. Tom extended his hand, not to offer forgiveness, but to signal that this was a turning point. He wasn't going to hold a grudge, but he needed to see change. Let's start fresh, Greg, Tom said. I don't want this place to be a battleground over something as silly as a hat. I want it to be a place where people can come and eat without fear of judgment. That's what this place has always been about. Greg took Tom's hand, shaking it firmly, his eyes filled with genuine gratitude. Thank you, Tom. I won't let you down again. As Tom walked to the back of the diner, his mind was racing. The conversation with Greg had been intense, but it was necessary. There was no room for complacency when it came to the values he held dear: respect, understanding, and fairness. Those weren't just words for Tom. They were principles he lived by, and he expected the same from everyone in his employ. But as much as he had hoped this confrontation would make a difference, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done. The kitchen was bustling as usual, with the clatter of pans and the rhythmic hum of the grill. It felt like a world apart from the heated discussion he had just had with Greg. Tom took a seat at the counter, his hands folded in front of him, and let his thoughts settle. The events of the past hour had been a whirlwind, and he needed to regain his focus. But it wasn't long before one of the other servers, a young woman named Sarah, approached him. She had been working at the diner for just over a year, and while she was generally quiet, Tom could tell that this incident had impacted her, too. Tom, can I talk to you for a second? Sarah asked, her voice soft but earnest. Tom looked up at her and nodded. Of course, Sarah. What's on your mind? Sarah hesitated for a moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. I just wanted to say, I'm really glad you stood up to Greg. I know he didn't mean to offend you, but I've seen stuff like this happen before. People getting kicked out just for their beliefs. It's not right. Tom smiled slightly, grateful for her honesty. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Sarah. It's not always easy to speak up, but sometimes it's necessary. No one should ever feel like they're less than someone else because of their views or what they wear. Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. I agree. I've been here long enough to know that we serve people from all walks of life. They come in for food, not to be judged. I just think maybe we all need to remember that. Tom leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of pride in the way Sarah had expressed herself. This wasn't just about the incident with Greg anymore. It was about a fundamental shift in the way the diner's staff understood their roles as employees, not just as workers, but as representatives of a space where everyone was welcome. You're right, Sarah, Tom said, his voice thoughtful. I hope Greg learned his lesson, but this is bigger than just one person. It's about creating an atmosphere where respect is the default setting. We can't just talk about it. We have to live it. I think Greg will come around, Sarah said. He's a good guy, but sometimes people need a wake-up call. You gave him that today. Tom nodded, appreciating her optimism. I hope so. He's been with us for a long time, and I don't want to lose him over something like this. But we can't afford to have this kind of thing happen again. There was a brief silence as Sarah collected her thoughts. I know it's not my place to say this, but I think some of the other customers might be thinking the same thing. I overheard a few conversations while I was clearing tables. People are starting to question if they'll be welcomed here, regardless of their political views. It might not be much right now, but I think it could grow if we're not careful. Tom's eyes narrowed as he processed Sarah's words. She was right. The situation had already begun to ripple out, even beyond the staff. Customers had witnessed the altercation, and while some of them might not have been bothered by it, others might have felt uncomfortable. The diner had always been a place for everyone, and Tom wasn't about to let that change because of a single incident. He stood up from his seat and patted Sarah on the shoulder. "Thanks for bringing that up. I'll handle it. We need to make sure that everyone who walks in here knows they're welcome, no matter what they believe or where." As Sarah walked back to her station, Tom's thoughts turned inward. This wasn't just about Greg anymore. It was about the reputation of the diner itself. People talked, and word traveled fast. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had the potential to turn into something bigger if he didn't act quickly. Tom wasn't one to shy away from tough conversations. He had built this diner from the ground up, and he had learned a lot over the years about what it meant to be a leader. It wasn't just about making decisions. It was about taking responsibility for those decisions, even when they were uncomfortable. He couldn't control what people thought about him or his business, but he could control the environment he created, and that environment had to be one where every single person, employee or customer, felt valued and respected. Tom took a deep breath and walked back into the main dining area. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the customers who had been there during the confrontation. Some of them were still eating, others were chatting among themselves. No one seemed particularly upset, but Tom could sense the undercurrent of tension. This incident hadn't gone unnoticed, and it wasn't just about one customer wearing a hat. It was about the values the diner represented. He walked to the front counter where Greg was nervously wiping down the surface. The younger man looked up as Tom approached, his face still pale. "Greg," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk about the staff and the customers. You're going to need to make an announcement. We can't let this linger. I want to make sure everyone knows that this place is about more than just food. It's about respect." Greg swallowed and nodded, his face reflecting the weight of Tom's words. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes." Tom nodded once, pleased that Greg was taking responsibility. "Good. It's not just about us. It's about everyone who walks through those doors. I'm trusting you to help set the tone here." "Yeah, I got it, Tom. Thanks for giving me a second chance." Tom gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Just don't forget why we're here. We're here to serve, not judge." The next few days following the incident with Greg felt like a whirlwind for Tom. The diner, as always, remained a local staple. It was the kind of place where regulars came to eat comfort food, catch up with friends, and gossip about the happenings of the week. But now, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Some of the old-timers who had been coming in for years seemed hesitant to comment, while the newer faces, those who had only recently discovered the diner, looked at things with fresh eyes, their opinions still in the making. Tom made it his mission to engage with as many customers as he could without being overbearing. His philosophy had always been that the diner was more than just a business. It was a community, and it wasn't enough to just serve good food. He needed to make sure the space remained one where everyone felt welcome. But now, he had to navigate this fine line. People had seen what had happened with Greg. They had witnessed the tension, and some had been unsettled by it. The last thing Tom wanted was to lose his loyal customers over something as trivial as a political disagreement. The first signs of the ripple effect came during the morning rush. A couple of regulars, Jim and Linda, walked in, talking animatedly about the news. They were both in their mid-50s, with graying hair and friendly faces that Tom recognized immediately. They were the kind of customers who often stayed for hours, gossiping with the other regulars and making jokes with the servers. But today, there was something different about them. "Hey, Tom," Jim called from across the room, his voice carrying with the authority of someone who had been coming to the diner longer than Tom had owned it. "Mind if we have a word with you?" Tom stood from behind the counter, his back straightening as he wiped his hands on his apron. "Of course, Jim. Everything all right?" Linda raised an eyebrow as she took a seat at the counter, signaling Tom to join them. "We were talking about what happened the other day with that customer and Greg. We didn't want to say anything before, but it seems like it's on everyone's mind." Tom took a seat across from them, trying to read their expressions. Jim and Linda were good people, honest and straightforward. He knew if there were any concerns, they wouldn't hesitate to voice them. "Yeah, I figured," Tom said, leaning forward. "Look, I know things got a little heated, but I want you to know that we're handling it. I spoke with Greg, and we're working on making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again." Jim looked at Tom seriously, his hands resting on the edge of his coffee cup. "We know, Tom. But here's the thing. You've built a place here that's been like a second home for so many people, and that includes people on all sides of the spectrum. There's something about this diner that makes people feel welcome, no matter their background. I think we were all a little worried when we saw what happened with that hat. It wasn't just about the hat, you know? It felt like the spirit of this place was on the line." Linda nodded, her lips pressed together in thought. "Right. It's not like we're a bunch of political pundits, but we don't like seeing anyone being treated differently because of something they wear. Whether it's a MAGA hat, a Black Lives Matter shirt, or anything else. You've built a place where people are just people when they come in here. We don't want that to change." Tom felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Jim and Linda had voiced exactly what he'd been feeling. He knew the diner had always been about more than just food. It was about a sense of community, and that had been jeopardized, even if for just a moment. What bothered him most was that he hadn't anticipated the far-reaching consequences of Greg's actions. He hadn't understood how such a seemingly small issue would make some of his customers question the diner's core values. "I hear you," Tom said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "It was never supposed to be about politics or any one person's views. I want this to be a place where people can come, eat, and feel like they're part of something bigger. We've always been that kind of place, and will continue to be. I'm going to talk to the staff more about it. We can't afford to let anyone feel unwelcome, regardless of what they wear or what they believe." Jim smiled slightly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We know you're a good guy, Tom. We've been coming here long enough to know that. Just don't let one bad apple spoil the whole bunch. You've got a good thing here. Just keep it going." Linda reached over, placing a hand on Tom's arm. "We just wanted you to know that we're behind you. But we also want to see this place stay the way it's always been. A spot for everyone." Tom smiled at both of them, the weight of their words sinking in. "Thanks. I appreciate you both. I'll take care of it. I won't let this place change. It's about everyone, not just a few." After their conversation, Tom felt a sense of relief that he hadn't realized he needed. Jim and Linda's support meant more than he could express, especially given how long they had been coming to the diner. It reminded him that the community he had built over the years wasn't just about the food. It was about the trust and respect he had earned from those who walked through his doors. Later that afternoon, as the lunch rush tapered off, Tom found himself sitting alone at a table near the window, staring out at the street. He had been thinking deeply about what Jim and Linda had said, and about the responsibility he carried. He wasn't just the owner of a diner. He was the steward of a space that had become something of a landmark in the town. It was a place where people didn't have to worry about the world outside. Inside those walls, they were just people. No labels, no divisions, just the simple act of sharing a meal together. And now, Tom had to make sure that wasn't lost. He had to reassure his customers, his staff, and himself that the diner was a sanctuary for all. No matter the hat, no matter the opinion, no matter the background. Tom's reflection was interrupted when the front door chimed, signaling the arrival of a new customer. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked to the counter. There was still work to do, but Tom knew one thing for sure. This diner would continue to be the welcoming, inclusive space it had always been. He would make sure of it. As the following days passed, Tom found himself reflecting even more on the nature of the diner and the incident with Greg. What started as a minor issue had slowly become the catalyst for something much bigger. A quiet, unspoken shift that rippled through both his business and the community. He wasn't entirely sure how to handle the newfound scrutiny, but one thing became clear. There were aspects of his business that had to be recalibrated. In the mornings, the diner was relatively quiet, offering a reprieve from the busy lunch and dinner crowds. The regulars would trickle in, some for their morning coffee, others for the full breakfast spread, and all for the camaraderie that came with it. Tom often found himself spending these quieter moments either working on the books or just chatting with his longtime customers, grateful for the calm before the storm. But that week, even during these slower hours, there was something different in the air. The conversations that took place in the corners of the diner were quieter, more guarded. Some patrons, who once discussed politics or current events openly, now hesitated, as if unsure whether the person across the table shared their views or if they could discuss anything without stepping on someone else's toes. The sense of unease was palpable, even if it wasn't overt. Tom could feel it in the way people looked at each other. There was a slight wariness in their eyes, as if each of them was mentally preparing for some sort of confrontation that might come at any moment. And it wasn't just the customers. Tom could tell that even his staff, usually so comfortable and easygoing, had started to feel the weight of the situation. Some of them seemed uncertain about how to approach customers who might express strong opinions, whether about the incident with Greg or the political tensions that seemed to be creeping into everything these days. By Friday afternoon, Tom knew something had to give. The diner had always been about connection, a place where people could come together regardless of their differences. But now, it felt like there was a divide in the air, a sense that the diner was no longer a sanctuary, but a battleground for opinions. People weren't as comfortable talking about everyday things anymore. They were holding back, looking over their shoulders to gauge the mood before speaking freely. And it was starting to affect business. Customers who once came in every day were now skipping meals, looking for other places to eat. There were no explicit complaints, but Tom could tell they were avoiding the diner. He had built a reputation on the diner being a neutral zone, a space where people could sit across from each other and disagree without ever having to raise their voices. But now, it seemed like the atmosphere had changed, and while Tom was sure the vast majority of his customers didn't want to see the diner become a place of political debate, he knew he couldn't let the tensions fester for too long. As the last customer of the evening left, Tom took a seat at his desk. He stared at the register, the pile of receipts, and the diner's schedule for the upcoming week. His mind raced. How had it come to this? One incident, one moment of conflict. And now everything felt different. The weight of it all seemed heavier than usual tonight, and he knew that if he didn't address it soon, the quiet would turn into something much worse, something that would be harder to undo. The clock on the wall ticked as Tom leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He was no stranger to tough decisions. He had faced challenges before in running the diner. There were the late nights where business was slow, the personal disputes between employees, and the tough decisions about whether to raise prices or change the menu. But this was different. The dynamics of his business had changed in a way that he didn't fully understand yet. He couldn't just ignore it and hope it would pass. The community was beginning to shift away from him, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. His first step, he decided, was to talk to his staff. He'd always prided himself on having an open, communicative relationship with his team. It was one of the things that made the diner special. The team worked like a family, and they cared about the success of the business as much as he did. If anyone could help him find a way forward, it was them. The next morning, Tom called for a staff meeting. It was early, just before the first rush of customers arrived. As the crew filtered into the back room, Tom could tell that there was still some apprehension in the air. They all sat down, some of them with their coffees in hand, some adjusting the collars of their uniforms as they prepared for the discussion ahead. "All right, folks," Tom began, standing at the front of the room, hands resting on the table in front of him. "I think we all know why we're here. I'm not going to beat around the bush. We've had a rough week, and I can feel it." The atmosphere's changed in the diner. Customers are skittish, and I know some of you are feeling that too. There was a collective silence, and for a moment, Tom saw the weight of the issue settle on his employees. He had always tried to maintain a sense of calm, but today, he wasn't sure how to keep that calm. "We've always been a place where everyone can come, sit down, and feel like they belong. It doesn't matter who you voted for, what you wear, or where you come from. We've made this place a sanctuary for our customers. But I know that's been tested this week." A few of the staff exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to respond. Tom took a deep breath, pushing forward. I want to hear your thoughts. How do we move forward from here? How do we make sure we stay true to what we've always been, without letting this divide take over? A young waitress, Maria, spoke up first. She had been with the diner for just under a year, but in that time she'd quickly become a fan favorite with her bright smile and friendly demeanor. I think people are just scared to speak their minds right now, she said softly, looking at Tom with a mix of concern and sincerity. I mean, there's been a lot of tension in the world, and it feels like no matter what we say, we're going to upset someone. Maybe we can find a way to keep the political stuff out of the diner. Just focus on the food, you know? Tom nodded slowly. It was a suggestion he had been thinking about himself. It made sense. The diner had always been about food, about comfort, about getting away from the outside world for a while. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to refocus on that. I agree, Maria, he said. Let's try to steer the conversations back to the things that matter to us here. Good food, good company, and keeping things light. We've always been able to keep that balance. After that, the rest of the staff began chiming in. Some agreed, others raised concerns about the potential backlash. But in the end, everyone seemed to want the same thing: peace. They wanted the diner to return to its roots, where people could walk in, enjoy a meal, and not feel like they were walking into a battleground of opinions. Tom felt a surge of hope. It wasn't over yet. There was work to be done, but he could already see the path forward. The next step would be implementing changes, quietly at first, to remind his community of the diner's true purpose. As Tom walked out of the back room, the staff meeting lingering in his mind, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but the support from his team made him believe that things could turn around. Rebuilding trust, especially after such a tumultuous week, was no small feat, but it was necessary. The diner had weathered many storms in the past, and Tom was confident it could do so again. The following week, Tom decided to take a subtle approach to ease the tension and bring back the old vibe of the diner. First and foremost, he instructed his staff to keep the political discussions at a minimum. It wasn't a ban on political talk, but rather an effort to avoid heated debates that had started to color every conversation. Customers needed to feel that they could leave the outside world behind when they walked through the diner's doors, and for that to happen, the atmosphere needed to shift back to its roots. Tom also made an effort to be more present in the diner, checking in with customers and staff alike. He knew he needed to show his face more, especially after the incident with Greg. His absence had created a sense of uncertainty, and people were questioning whether he still had control over the diner's direction. By making himself more visible, he hoped to reassure everyone that the diner was still in good hands. The first few days after the staff meeting felt like a trial period, and Tom kept a watchful eye on how things unfolded. At first, the results were mixed. Some customers returned, but many were still hesitant. They were waiting to see how Tom would address the underlying issues that had caused the rift. There was still a sense of unease in the air, but Tom didn't let that discourage him. He was playing the long game. One of his strategies was to engage in casual conversations with the regulars who had been frequenting the diner for years. He'd sit down at their booths, ask about their families, and talk about the usual small-town matters. He kept the tone light, steering clear of anything remotely controversial. Over time, these small interactions began to repair some of the damage. Word spread that Tom was actively working to make the diner a neutral, welcoming space again, and slowly but surely, the loyal customers started trickling back in. The biggest hurdle, however, was how to address the lingering tension between his employees and the customers who had witnessed Greg's confrontation. Tom knew that for true healing to take place, he had to address the issue head-on without making anyone feel blamed or isolated. One afternoon, as the diner filled up with the usual lunchtime crowd, Tom gathered his staff again. But this time, it was more informal. It was just a chance to talk, to touch base, and to see how everyone was feeling after the changes they'd implemented. I know things have been a little awkward, Tom began, pacing slightly as he looked at the group, but I think we're getting there. We've made a conscious effort to shift the vibe in here, to go back to what we know works, and I've seen the results. People are coming back, even if it's just a few at a time, and that's progress. There was a murmur of agreement from the group, but Tom could tell that some of his staff members were still unsure. A couple of them had been there when Greg was asked to leave, and they still felt the weight of that moment. "I know we all handled the Greg situation differently," Tom continued, his voice calm but direct. "But here's what matters. We're in this together. We're a team. And while the customer is always important, so are you. I'm not going to stand by and let anyone get disrespected, whether it's a customer or one of you." The staff seemed to relax a little at that, their shoulders loosening as Tom's words sank in. They had been waiting for reassurance, and now they had it. Tom wasn't blaming them for what happened. He was acknowledging that it had been a tough moment for everyone involved. "We just need to keep our focus on what we do best. We're here to serve people, not to judge them. Whether they're wearing a MAGA hat or not, it doesn't change that they're here for a meal, for a friendly atmosphere, and for the kind of service that makes this place special. And that's what we're going to keep giving them." The meeting wrapped up on a positive note, with everyone feeling a little more at ease. It wasn't an immediate fix, but Tom felt a sense of relief. He had addressed the issue without pointing fingers, and he had reminded his team of the core values that had made the diner a success for so many years. In the following days, Tom started to notice more familiar faces returning to the diner. The regulars who had hesitated to come back were now walking in with a smile, exchanging pleasantries with the staff, and settling into their usual booths. It was clear that people were starting to feel comfortable again, even if it was in small doses. By the end of the month, the diner had found a new rhythm. Business was picking up, but more importantly, the atmosphere had returned to its familiar, relaxed state. There was no longer the undercurrent of tension that had once threatened to consume everything. Tom had successfully navigated through a difficult situation, and now, with a little patience and effort, he had restored the diner to its rightful place in the community. Still, Tom knew the work wasn't over. He would continue to monitor the atmosphere, ensuring that the diner remained a welcoming space for all. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant attention. But for now, he felt like the worst was behind him. As the weeks passed, the diner began to regain a sense of normalcy, though Tom knew this process was more fragile than anyone realized. It wasn't just about getting customers to walk through the door. It was about getting them to feel at home again. The old comfort that once defined the diner had been tarnished, and it would take more than just a few good weeks to erase the sting of past events. Tom took pride in seeing the familiar faces of regulars returning. Mrs. Duncan, the retired schoolteacher who always ordered the same thing, the scrambled eggs with toast and a side of grits, was back in her usual spot by the window. Old Man Rogers, the widower who spent most afternoons at the diner, reading the newspaper and sipping coffee, had started showing up again. There was an undeniable sense of familiarity in their presence, and Tom couldn't help but smile each time he saw them walk in. They weren't just customers. They were part of the fabric that had made the diner feel like home for so long. But Tom was also aware that not everyone had returned. There was still a chunk of the diner's loyal customer base that remained hesitant, unsure about whether the establishment had truly recovered from the incident with Greg. Tom didn't blame them. After all, it wasn't every day that a restaurant turned into a battleground for political discourse. He understood that it would take time for some people to feel comfortable again, especially when the lines between personal beliefs and public behavior had become so blurred. Tom decided to reach out to a few of the regulars he hadn't seen in a while. His goal wasn't to pressure anyone into coming back, but to show that he genuinely cared about their presence at the diner. A few phone calls, some handwritten notes, and a couple of personal invitations to stop by made a huge difference. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted to rebuild the bridge that had been broken. One evening, as the sun began to set and the soft hum of conversation filled the diner, Tom was pleasantly surprised to see one of his most loyal patrons, Jake, a local mechanic, step through the door. Jake had been one of the first people to voice his displeasure after the incident, but now he was here, walking in with a smile on his face. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he saw the mechanic approach the counter. "Evening, Tom," Jake said, sliding into his usual booth. "It's been a while." Tom wasted no time. He grabbed a menu and headed over, his hand shaking slightly with nervous energy. "Jake, it's great to see you again. How's the shop?" Jake shrugged, a relaxed grin spreading across his face. Same old, but I figured it was time to come back. You've got a good thing here, and I can't let some bad blood spoil it. Tom nodded, his relief palpable. I get it, and I appreciate you giving us another shot. I'm working hard to make sure something like that doesn't happen again. This diner is about good food, good company, and a place where people can just be themselves. Jake gave him a knowing look. I'm glad to hear it. Everyone's got their opinions, Tom. But as long as you keep serving up that pie, I think you'll be all right. Tom chuckled, the tension easing out of his body. Pies on the house today? Jake laughed. All right then. Jake laughed. Maybe I'll have 2 slices. As Tom walked back to the kitchen, he felt a surge of pride. It wasn't just about the pie or the coffee. It was the simple fact that someone like Jake, who had been so vocal in his criticism, was now willing to give the diner another chance. It felt like a small victory, a sign that things were heading in the right direction. That evening, as the diner started to fill up with the usual mix of customers, Tom took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. There had been so much tension, so many questions, so much fallout from that one moment. The incident with Greg. But as the diner slowly filled with the familiar sounds of chatter, clinking silverware, and the low hum of the jukebox in the corner, Tom realized something important. The diner was more than just a place to eat. It was a reflection of the community it served. And just as communities went through trials and tribulations, so too would the diner. Tom didn't have all the answers, and he knew that the road ahead would still come with challenges. But one thing was certain: he wasn't giving up. This was his place, his family, and no matter what happened, he would fight to keep it the welcoming, inclusive space it had always been. The next few weeks brought more signs of recovery. The diner's social media pages, which had been quiet for a while, were beginning to see more engagement. Customers started posting pictures of their meals again, tagging the diner and writing positive reviews. The number of complaints had decreased significantly, and the atmosphere inside had improved dramatically. Yet, Tom knew better than to assume that everything was back to normal. The diner's reputation had been tested, and it would take continuous effort to ensure that it remained a place of inclusivity and respect. The challenges might not have been over, but Tom was ready to face them head on. On a Friday afternoon, as the diner was packed with the usual after-work crowd, Tom found himself standing by the counter, observing the familiar rhythm of the place. A steady flow of waitstaff moved between tables, delivering food with practiced ease. The chatter was light, the mood relaxed. There was no sense of the political division that had once seeped into the very fabric of the diner. Then, from across the room, he spotted Greg, the man who had sparked it all. He was sitting at the far end of the diner, quietly sipping on a coffee. It took a moment for Tom to process what he was seeing. Greg had been absent for weeks, and now, here he was, alone in a booth. Tom hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should approach him or leave him to his thoughts. But then, he made a decision. This wasn't about avoiding the situation or pretending it didn't happen. It was about taking ownership and showing that he was still committed to running the diner with respect for everyone, no matter their views. Tom walked across the diner and stopped at Greg's table. The man looked up, startled, but there was no hostility in his gaze. In fact, there was a hint of curiosity there, as if he was waiting for Tom to say something. "Mind if I sit down for a minute?" Tom asked. Greg shrugged, his demeanor relaxed. "It's your place." Tom slid into the booth, taking a seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was one of those awkward silences that can either make or break a conversation. Tom broke it first. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for how things went down," Tom said. "I think I could have handled it better." But Greg looked at him for a long time before responding. "I didn't mean to make things messy, Tom. I just felt like you weren't really listening." Tom nodded. "I get it. I should have done more to make sure everyone felt heard. I've been trying to make the place feel like home again. I hope we can both agree that it's not just about the politics. It's about the food, the service, and the people who walk in here." Greg's lips curled into a half smile. "I can agree with that. I can agree with that. I guess we all get a little too wrapped up in things sometimes." They sat in silence for a few more moments, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a rare moment of understanding between two people who had clashed in the past, but now seemed to see eye to eye. Finally, Greg broke the silence. "You're doing all right, Tom. Keep it up." Tom smiled. "Thanks, Greg. I'll do my best." Tom was barely able to focus on his work as he entered the kitchen the morning after the incident. The sounds of clattering dishes and the whirring of the fridge felt muffled, as if they were coming from somewhere distant. His mind kept replaying the scene from the night before. The way he'd been kicked out, the sharp sting of the insult, the arrogance of the employee who thought he knew everything. He had never intended for his hat to cause such a stir. Tom was proud of the simple life he had built for himself. And if wearing that hat on occasion was a way to show his pride in his country, he didn't think anyone else had the right to judge him for it. Yet here he was, forced to confront something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. As he set up for the morning's rush, Tom found himself reflecting on the words that the manager had said before escorting him out. "This is not a place for that kind of political statement," she had snapped. "We're not interested in causing any kind of conflict." Her tone had been biting, dismissive. At first, Tom wanted to write it off as a misunderstanding. After all, he'd been a loyal customer of the diner for years. He had spent his hard-earned money in that place, time and time again, enjoying the quiet comfort it offered. Never had he imagined that a hat would be enough to strip him of that privilege. But now, as the hours passed and the diner started to fill with the usual mix of customers, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this incident had been about more than just a hat. It was about something deeper, something insidious. The look in the manager's eyes. There was something in her gaze, something that told him this was personal. He wasn't just some inconvenience. He had become a target. Before he could get lost in his thoughts any longer, the bell above the diner's door rang, signaling the arrival of another customer. Tom instinctively looked up, only to freeze in place when he saw who it was. The same manager who had kicked him out the night before walked in. She was wearing her work uniform, her posture straight, but there was a nervous energy about her as she scanned the diner. When her eyes met his, she hesitated, then walked toward him. "Tom," she began, her voice softer than he expected. "We need to talk." Tom didn't respond immediately. His pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral, unwilling to let her see how much this situation was affecting him. "I didn't want it to go down like this," she continued. "But we have rules here, and your hat, well, it went against them." "It's just that simple." Tom let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Rules? The hat's just a hat. It's not political. It's just a statement." The woman's gaze softened a little, and for a moment, Tom thought she might actually understand. But her next words shattered that fragile hope. "It's not about the hat, Tom. It's about the kind of people who are going to cause trouble over something like that. The kind of people who don't see things the way we do. They'll stop coming here. They'll tell others not to come. And suddenly, this whole place gets a bad reputation." Tom couldn't believe his ears. His gut churned as he realized what she was implying. She wasn't just trying to keep the peace. She was bowing to some external pressure, some invisible force that had less to do with him and more to do with what others might think. "You really think a hat is going to make or break your business?" Tom said, shaking his head. "I've been coming here for years, and now you're telling me that because of one stupid piece of fabric I'm not welcome anymore?" The manager looked uncomfortable. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, the bell above the door jingled again. Conclusion: the true power of ownership. As Tom stood at the counter, the realization hit him like a wave crashing onto his shore. The diner wasn't just a place where he worked. It was a part of his identity. It wasn't just about the food or the people who walked through the door. It was about what he had built. The heart and soul of the diner had been his from the start, and no one had the right to tell him what he could or couldn't stand for. The manager's words echoed in his mind as he stepped forward. "You think this place belongs to you, but it doesn't. It belongs to all of us, to the customers, to the community." Tom took a deep breath, his mind clearing as he looked the manager in the eye. "You're wrong," he said, his voice firm and calm. "This place doesn't belong to anyone but me, and if you can't respect that, then you don't belong here." The manager opened her mouth, but Tom didn't give her a chance to respond. He turned on his heel and walked to the back office, shutting the door behind him. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone and dialed the number he'd been avoiding for days. As the phone rang, Tom knew that everything had changed. He wasn't just fighting for his diner anymore. He was fighting for his right to be himself, unapologetically, and without compromise. The world may have changed around him, but Tom wasn't going to let anyone take away what he had built. The phone clicked, and a voice on the other end answered. "Tom, what can I do for you?" "I need to make a decision," Tom said, his voice steady now. "I'm ready to sell the diner." The silence on the other end was heavy, but it was the right choice. Tom wasn't going to let the world tell him how to live. He had built something that mattered, and he would defend it, no matter the cost. In the end, it wasn't about politics, about a hat, or about anyone else's opinion. It was about ownership, and that was something no one could take away from him.